Bran Stark did not know how many heartbeats had passed since he had gone into the past. Time was a labyrinth of twisting corridors where memories of what had happened and whispers of what could happen clashed and tangled into one. He had ventured there seeking answers, or perhaps an explanation, for the doom that he and his family had faced in the present. Now he felt the weight of years pressing upon him like an ancient tree's branches, sagging with snow and with age. He had, with all the power contained in his fragile body, slipped into the undercurrent of time to observe events as they were, and to glean secrets from the past that might save Westeros from the endless winter. Yet something else took root within him the moment he arrived, a potent surge of presence and power, as though the weirwood roots in the cave of the three-eyed raven had sunk into the ground of time itself, binding him there. He had once believed the past was unchangeable, that it was carved in stone, and all his visits were only illusions, echoes that he could observe but never truly alter. The three-eyed raven had warned him, cryptic but resolute. The past is already written. The ink is dry. But as Bran had grown into the power of green sight and skin changing, a dreadful possibility dawned on him, that if he touched the past too pointedly, it might break. He had caused Hodder to break. He had done more than watch. He had changed something in the boy Wylis's mind and created Hodder, his gentle giant who died to hold the door. That was only a taste of what he could do if he lingered longer, more recklessly, in times long gone. It was a chain that tethered him to caution. But events moved swiftly, and desperation had grown deeper. The dead marched south. The living formed alliances, yet all were overshadowed by the cold might of the Night King. Bran's hold on the present had become tenuous, his body threatened by the unstoppable wave of whites in the Great War for the Dawn. And so, in a moment of dire necessity, he had reached out too far and not returned. Something else had seized him, or perhaps he had seized it, and found himself anchored to the era he had been exploring. He did not remember precisely when he realized he was no longer just a visiting spirit. Perhaps the moment he attempted to pull his consciousness back to the future, to his real, living body, and was met with silence. Perhaps it was the instant he felt a great severing, as if the cord of time that connected him forward had been cut. The hush was as jarring as a sword leaving its scabbard. The forest around him in this prior century felt too tangible, the wind too crisp, and the swirling forms of men and women in older garb paid him no heed, because they did not see him. He was there, but not in a form that eyes could recognize. He was an echo, or so he thought, pinned to the weirwoods, his spirit caught in their roots while his body somewhere in the future fell slack and lifeless. Only the old gods might know what had truly happened, or what the power of the Greenseers truly was. He felt an endless hush, the swirl of leaves, the calmness before a tempest. In this strange state he roamed, searching for a tether, searching for a reason. And then he felt an insatiable pull. If he was stuck, he might as well watch, might as well glean the crucial events and perhaps, if it was possible, do some good. A hope that he might still alter the future formed in him. Even if the three-eyed raven had once told him the past was set, he had to test that boundary once more. He had to see if there was a single thread he could weave differently. He knew that if he was not careful, he might risk creating schisms that reverberated across centuries. But the knowledge of doom that awaited humankind if no changes were made weighed heavily on him. So he flew along the currents of time like a raven, though not precisely by choice anymore, drifting in an age decades before his own birth. The Targaryens still ruled from the Iron Throne. The Starks in Winterfell, long in the habit of quiet governance and patient watchfulness, remained honorable wardens of the North. The ancient alliances were not yet undone by rebellion. Ned Stark was but a child in the Vale, learning from Jon Arryn. Lyanna Stark had not been born, or perhaps was just an infant. Bran's own father was only a boy in these days. All the events that had shaped Bran's life were just on the horizon. At first, he lingered among the old gods, at weirwood trees where the faces carved into the trunks stared with weeping red eyes. His vantage point gave him glimpses of those who prayed, those who knelt. He listened to every prayer, gleaning how men and women thought in that time. If he so chose, he could beckon small changes in them. Sometimes, in hushed amazement. He felt that his presence could place faint whispers in their minds. But he had to be gentle. Even a slight nudge might cause unforeseen consequences. A life could change from a single whisper. He had learned that with Hodder, poor, sweet Hodder. Yet as the days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, a slow metamorphosis took place. Bran recognized that he could take a shape, not just remain an invisible observer. He drifted into ravens, testing their flight. From them, he soared from one corner of Westeros to the other. Eventually, he grew bolder. There were wolves in the woods, men in mead halls, children in courtyards, and he realized he could slip into them if they were unguarded. If they had that susceptibility, that open gate in the mind. It was a grave power, yet curiosity and hope moved his hand. He needed to glean knowledge, to speak to men who had shaped the future, or so he had read in the histories. Perhaps he could glean a route to unite Westeros earlier, or warn them about the White Walkers, or stoke the embers of the old magic in those who might listen. He found himself at Harrenhal one day, as the seat of many Targaryen lords or those under the crown's direct authority. Its melted towers were monstrous even in that earlier age. Great tournaments were held there, lavish feasts, plots hatched. He watched as lords and ladies of every major house visited. With the perspective of time, he recognized certain players who would grow prominent in the decade to come. He recognized Lord Walder Frey in a younger form, more energetic but no less cunning, spindly hands tapping at the banquet table. He saw the seeds of alliances forming, the first hush of suspicion that would eventually topple the Targaryen dynasty. Hovering in the body of a raven perched on a high windowsill, Bran listened to their words. The knowledge of all that had gone wrong in his future weighed upon him. The Mad King's final years were not far off. The tragedy of Rhaegar Targaryen, the year of the false spring, Lyanna Stark's abduction, Robert's rebellion, these events branched out from here. Bran felt a pang of sorrow each time he realized how close it was, how precariously balanced. He slipped through the fortress halls in the shape of a cat next, silent and unseen. The knights who warmed themselves at the hearth or jested over cups of ale had no inkling that a boy from the future crouched among the shadows, gleaning their secrets. He realized that time was a tapestry of thousands of threads. Pluck one free and you changed the picture. But which thread should he pluck? The White Walkers were still a bedtime story told in hushed tones. The realms of men had not yet turned their attention northward with fear. The Starks themselves only quietly preserved the old ways, waiting for winter to come as they always had. Bran considered traveling further back, perhaps centuries back to the era of the Long Night, to see for himself how the first men and the children of the forest had fought the others. But that was too distant, and his anchor in this particular time was stronger. He was not sure if he could skip across centuries so easily now that he was no longer just a visitor. This was the time he found himself in, so perhaps it was here he had to act. Each day he learned more about the range of his power. In hushed moments, the weirwood trees called to him, urging him to watch carefully. He found that, with enough focus, he could slip whispers into the minds of lords or ladies at prayer beneath the carved faces of ancient trunks. The old gods did not speak in words so much as impressions, images, feelings. He tried to be subtle, but sometimes the best route to forging change was a direct push. He tested it first on minor knights who prayed for glory. He would show them a flash of war, of the dead rising, of a winter black as crow feathers. Some walked away shaken, but they soon shrugged it off as nightmares. Dreams were fleeting. Over time, Bran grew more adept. He found that if he repeated these visions with just a bit more intensity each time, the mortal mind would respond. Some men would become devout believers in the old gods. Others would think themselves cursed or haunted. But a few, a special few, might heed the warning. That was how he found the traveling hedge knight Gone Redwood. A man with enough fear to keep him awake at night, but also enough courage to try to do something about it. Redwood came from a small family in the north, his father a minor retainer at White Harbor. He had grown up hearing tales of the others. One day, Redwood knelt beneath a weirwood and prayed for guidance because he had woken from yet another half-dream, half-vision of white shadows crossing the land. His sweaty brow touched the root, and Bran pressed himself forward, giving Redwood a clearer glimpse of the monstrous whites, the unstoppable Night King, and the frigid winds that threatened all. The Hedge Knight gasped and pulled back, shaking. But instead of running, he came back the following day and prayed again, asking for some sign of what to do. That was how it started. In Redwood's mind, Bran left impressions of the same future that had so haunted him. Redwood saw glimpses of a great war that no Southern lords believed in. Over several nights, Redwood gleaned that these were warnings from the old gods, bidding him to pass the knowledge northward. Redwood was a nobody with no authority, but he was persistent. He started telling any who would listen that winter was coming, truly coming, that the darkest horrors beyond the wall would not remain behind the ice for much longer. He talked to every house's men he encountered, from House Dustin to House Bolton, House Reed to House Manderley. Most laughed or ignored him, but Redwood's fervor only grew. Bran watched from behind Redwood's eyes, occasionally nudging him to speak certain words that might spark a memory in a more important retainer or a minor lord who would not dismiss Redwood outright. It was a slow, painstaking process. Bran was unsure if it would be enough to stir the North into action decades before the others truly came. But it was a start. Meanwhile, in the south, the seeds of rebellion were being sown. King Aerys Targaryen was not yet wholly mad but was well on his way. Rhaegar, the crown prince, was beloved by many but misunderstood. The power of House Baratheon rested in the Stormlands, with a younger Lord Steffan, father to Robert. House Lannister, House Tyrell, House Martell, they all played their subtle game. The realm was uneasy but stable for the moment. Bran realized that to truly shift history, he might need to alter a key event or two. The Harrenhal tourney would come, the place where Rhaegar crowned Lyanna Stark as the Queen of Love and Beauty, inflaming old animosities and sowing the seeds for Robert's rebellion. Or perhaps he could intervene in other ways, perhaps by preventing the worst of the Mad King's atrocities. But how far was he willing to go? The three-eyed raven had taught him that a single alteration could unravel everything. And yet, the alternative was a future that might not defeat the White Walkers in time. He reminded himself that saving House Stark from tragedy was not the only reason. It was saving all of Westeros, all the living from the Great Other. If there was a chance to unify the realm under a strong and sane king earlier, to prepare for the real war, perhaps it could avert the tragedies that had befallen his siblings, his father, the entire realm. So he turned his attention to the key players. Quietly, carefully, he found his way into the Godswood at King's Landing, one of the few that remained behind the Red Keep. The weirwood there was a lonely old trunk, seldom visited by the Targaryens or their court, but sometimes used by visiting lords from the north. Bran latched himself to that tree, letting his spirit seep in. His vantage opened to him the daily goings-on in the Red Keep, the bustling halls, the petty intrigues, the private conferences. King Aerys was rarely out of sight of his Kingsguard. Rhaegar, in his more reflective moments, still visited the Maiden Vault or the library. It was through the presence in that Godswood that Bran realized he could, in rare moments, catch glimpses of the king's inner sanctum. If he found a particularly receptive mind among the king's servants or guard, he might plant the seeds of caution, perhaps even stop some of the king's cruelties. But the king's madness was not wholly of the mind that could be steered by gentle nudges. The seeds were deeper, a cruelty that had grown over years. Rhaegar, however, was a different story. He was a man of prophecy. He studied the signs of the return of the others, the promised prince that was foretold. If Bran could only guide Rhaegar to interpret the prophecy in a manner that unified the realm instead of dividing it. He tried, after some weeks, to slip into the mind of a young squire who attended Rhaegar, a bright-eyed lad from a lesser branch of House Derry. Through the squire's eyes, he saw Rhaegar studying old tomes, reading the visions of Daenerys the Dreamer, analyzing portents that might point to the coming of dragons or the long night. Rhaegar was thoughtful, gentle in demeanor, a man who questioned everything. Bran planted a small compulsion in the squire, to mention that some worshippers of the old gods in the north were speaking of the others stirring, that certain hedge knights carried warnings. Rhaegar's brow furrowed, interest peaked, but he moved on to the next question. Day after day, the squire brought up tidbits, always couched in innocent curiosity. Did the crown prince think that the legends of the White Walkers might be related to the prince that was promised? Rhaegar replied once in a private moment that perhaps he had read the prophecy thoroughly from the ancient scrolls that still remained in the Red Keep's library. Some lines pointed to a savior born of fire and salt, but others hinted at ice and the union of the realm. Rhaegar mused that perhaps it was not so simple as Targaryen lineage. Perhaps the blood of the North played a role. He seemed excited, as if a piece of the puzzle had been revealed. Bran felt a swell of hope. If he could push Rhaegar to see that forging alliances with the North was paramount, maybe, just maybe, they would not be so divided when the time came. Rhaegar, for his part, was not ignorant to his father's cruelty, and he hungered for a realm that was just. Still, the prince was cautious. He tiptoed around the king's paranoid gaze. And each day, the king slipped a bit further into mania. At last, the squire gleaned that a grand tourney was being planned at Harrenhal, rumored to be the largest in living memory. Rhaegar was behind it, or so the squire believed. Officially, it was sponsored by Lord Went, but the gold and impetus might have come from Rhaegar. The squire was told to keep quiet, but the rumors spread like wildfire through the keep, to the delight of many lords who fancied their chances at glory. Through that vantage, Bran felt the stirrings of fate again. He knew that Harrenhal was a nexus point in the timeline. So many things hinged on what happened there. From the crowning of Lyanna Stark as Queen of Love and Beauty, to the seeds of rebellion in Robert Baratheon's heart. Bran slipped back to the north for a time, drifting on the wings of ravens, to see how Redwood fared. The Hedge Knight had not made as large a stir as Bran hoped, but he had begun collecting a small group of like-minded men near White Harbor. They planned to journey to Winterfell and beg audience with Lord Rhaegar Stark, father of Ned Stark, to speak of the old god's warnings. Perhaps that would come to something, perhaps not, but Redwood was determined. Bran found Redwood one night, kneeling in the local god's wood, seeking guidance. With a gentle push, he urged Redwood to travel to Harrenhal, where many lords and ladies would gather. Redwood's efforts were needed there, where the entire realm would converge. Redwood obeyed the whisper, thinking it a sign from the old gods. In the months leading to Harrenhal, the realm buzzed. Knights prepared. Minstrels composed ballads about a glorious competition that might surpass any in a century. Lords from across Westeros traveled with their entourages, caravans rattling along the king's road. Rhaegar prepared quietly, for he intended not only to appear but to compete, though rumors said the king frowned upon it. The great houses would all be represented. Lord Rhaegar Stark would come with his children. Robert Baratheon, then betrothed to Lyanna Stark, would come, as would a young Eddard Stark from the Vale, accompanied by Robert. Jon Arryn would be there as well. Prince Oberyn Martell, perhaps. Mace Tyrell. Tywin Lannister and his Golden Knights, though Tywin himself might not compete, he was too proud not to make a show. Bran knew the shape of these events from the histories old Nan had told him, from the stories his father had once recounted. Yet to experience them firsthand was something else entirely. He soared above on the back of a crow, drifting among the tents and pavilions pitched in the shadow of Harrenhal's melted towers. The crowds were enormous. Vendors sold roasted meats, hot bread, flagons of ale and wine. Minstrels sang love songs in the fading sunlight, and children dashed between the throngs, laughing. Squires hurried about, carrying lances, shields, polish, anything the knights demanded. Tension laced the air, that electric sense that something grand and irreversible was about to happen. He found Redwood among the lesser knights, camped by a small tent, battered armor leaning against a wooden post. Redwood had not come to joust. He was no tourney knight. He had come to speak to Rhaegar Stark if he could and, if all else failed, to any influential noble who might listen. A swirl of anxiety and excitement filled Redwood's stomach. Through Redwood's eyes, Bran saw that the man was nearly trembling. All around them were the powers of the realm. Redwood felt an urge to turn back, but Bran whispered encouragement, showing Redwood fleeting images of the endless army of the dead. Redwood shuddered, but he steeled himself. He would speak. He would warn. On the second day of the tourney, Redwood managed to corner a steward of House Stark, who told him that Lord Rhaegar was busy, that Redwood must wait. Redwood waited an entire day, hearing the cheers from the jousting fields, the trumpet blasts, the roar of the crowd. He saw glimpses of Prince Rhaegar unhorsing several knights. He saw the sullen expression of Robert Baratheon, who was more eager to drink and jest than pay attention to politicking. He saw Eddard Stark's reserved smiles as the younger man congratulated winners. Redwood steeled himself and kept waiting. At night, the feast in the great hall soared into revelry. Rhaegar played his harp, mesmerizing the crowd. Redwood, uninvited to the high table, sat in the corners, nibbling on scraps and looking for an opening. At last, near midnight, Redwood caught Eddard Stark alone in a quiet alcove. Eddard had stepped away from the hall for a moment of respite. Redwood approached, explaining that he was from the north, from near White Harbor, that he had visions from the old gods of an oncoming threat. Eddard frowned, uncertain if Redwood was a madman or a prophet. Redwood insisted that the old gods had shown him shadows in the far north, that the wall would not be enough to stop them if the realm was not united. Eddard had heard the tales, of course, as all Northmen had, but they were ancient stories. Redwood's passion and sincerity, along with the hint of real fear in his eyes, gave Eddard pause. He said little, but he promised Redwood that he would speak to his father. Redwood thanked him and bowed, hope filling him. That same night, Redwood mustered the courage to try for Rhaegar, but the Targaryen prince was far harder to approach. Surrounded by Kingsguard and lords seeking his favor, Redwood found no easy path. Then, near the Godswood, Redwood spotted the prince alone, strumming quietly on his harp. The silver-haired man looked lost in thought, gazing at the heart tree. Redwood took a chance and stepped forward, announcing himself as Gone Redwood. Rhaegar looked upon the battered hedge knight with curiosity. Redwood spoke haltingly, referencing the old gods and the visions. He repeated many of the lines that Bran had implanted in him, about the stirring of the dead in the far north, about the need to unify. To Redwood's shock, Rhaegar did not laugh or dismiss him. Instead, the prince's violet eyes studied Redwood carefully. "I, too, have read and dreamt," Rhaegar said softly. "How did the old gods speak to you?" Redwood could not precisely articulate. He spoke of nights by the weirwood, of dreams full of swirling snow and pale spiders, of white shadows with blue eyes. Rhaegar listened. Something akin to recognition flickered across the prince's face. He set down his harp and asked Redwood why he came to him with this. Redwood answered, "Because you are a man of prophecy, they say, and if you believe, you can rally the realm." Rhaegar's gaze turned distant. "The realm is fractured, Redwood. My father grows more suspicious by the day. If this threat from the north is real, we must approach it with caution, or men will laugh us out of council. And if I press too hard against the king's own cynicism, it may end poorly for me or for the realm." Redwood bowed his head. He had no solution, but Rhaegar placed a hand on Redwood's shoulder. "You have done well to speak. Let me think on this." And then the prince departed, leaving Redwood to the hush of the Godswood. Bran, observing from Redwood's mind, felt a thrum of anticipation. A man like Rhaegar would not forget these warnings. Rhaegar believed in prophecy. He might piece together Redwood's claims with his own research, forging some new path. Perhaps that was enough. Yet, across the castle, events churned like a restless sea. This was the night Rhaegar would crown Lyanna Stark as the Queen of Love and Beauty, according to the old timeline. Bran drifted from Redwood's mind into that of a passing raven, soared above the stands to watch the final justs. He saw Rhaegar, gleaming in Targaryen armor, tilt against the final challenger. Cheers thundered. Rhaegar rode superbly, unhorsing the last knight. The crowd went wild. In the original timeline, he rode past his wife, Elia Martell, and placed the crown of winter roses in Lyanna's lap, spurring talk of scandal and igniting Robert's fury. Bran wondered, had his subtle influence changed anything? Might Rhaegar pause, weighed by Redwood's warnings, reconsider the realm's unity above the matter of a mysterious Stark girl? The crowd hushed as Rhaegar urged his horse forward. Lyanna Stark sat with her brothers, Brandon and Eddard, and her father, Rhaegar. She was beautiful, spirited, wearing a faint smile. Rhaegar slowed and looked up at her, a tension so palpable it rang in the air. Then, all at once, Rhaegar set his lance aside and took from a squire's hands a crown of blue roses. The hush deepened. He passed by Elia, though he glanced at her with what looked like regret, and rode on to Lyanna. With solemn grace, he placed the crown in her lap. Gasps rippled through the spectators. Murmurs of astonishment, admiration, scandal. Robert Baratheon's face hardened like stone. Ned Stark wore a confused, pained look, uncertain what this might mean. Lyanna was flushed, uncertain whether to laugh or protest. Rhaegar lingered only a moment, and then turned his mount and rode away, the champion of the day. Nothing had changed. The scene played out as Bran remembered from stories. Despair nibbled at Bran's heart. Perhaps time was a river that refused to be redirected, or perhaps he simply had not done enough. That single moment loomed large, an event that would eventually set House Stark and House Baratheon on a collision course with the crown. But maybe the path from here on could still be altered. Rhaegar had at least heard Redwood's warnings. He was aware that the realm needed uniting. The question was whether that awareness would overshadow his personal desires, or if his personal desires would overshadow the realm's needs. In the days after the tourney, rumors flew. Some said Rhaegar had chosen Lyanna as the new queen, spurning his wife. Others insisted he was only paying homage to the north, mindful of a prophecy requiring the union of ice and fire. Anger flared from Robert's side. The seeds of rebellion were sown more deeply. Meanwhile, Redwood tried again to speak to Rhaegar Stark, but the old lord was consumed with dealing with the scandal swirling around his daughter's name. Redwood found no audience. The hedge knight left Harrenhal, dejected, traveling back north. Bran soared after Rhaegar, who returned to King's Landing. For days, the prince sequestered himself, reading old scrolls, scribbling notes, occasionally venturing out to speak in hushed tones with a few trusted friends, among them Ser Arthur Dayne and Prince Lewin Martell. Bran gleaned from passing servants that Rhaegar believed the realm needed a single champion to unite them, that he was uncertain if that champion was himself or some child yet to be born. He wanted to speak to Lord Rhaegar Stark again, to see if alliances could be made. But how to do that without spiking the king's paranoia and Robert's fury? Bran found that no matter how he tried to nudge Rhaegar's mind through the squire or the weirwood, the prince was so consumed with prophecy that it became a labyrinth of possible futures. Rhaegar believed that the union of a dragon and a wolf might produce a child of destiny. He was fixated on the notion of a promised prince, though part of him seemed deeply remorseful for slighting Elia Martell. Another part felt that Elia herself might not be able to bear more children safely, so he needed another mother. All these swirling thoughts spurred him to action, and eventually, he left the city under mysterious circumstances. Lyanna Stark disappeared from Winterfell soon after, though it was rumored she had been taken by the prince or that she had run away with him willingly. And the old timeline marched on. Brandon Stark, Lyanna's hot-tempered brother, rode south in outrage. Rhaegar Stark followed, seeking justice from the king. The chain of events that led to their horrific deaths at King Aerys' order loomed again. Robert Baratheon's rage boiled over. Rebellion brewed. Bran, horrified, realized he had changed almost nothing. Could he let this cataclysm happen again? Yet if he intervened too blatantly, might the timeline warp beyond recognition? A realm united early was one thing, but what if he shattered the realm with a different sort of chaos? He did not have endless time to muse. The moment of Rhaegar Stark's arrival in King's Landing was soon upon them. Summoning what courage he had, Bran tried one final gambit. He found the weirwood in the Red Keep's Godswood and used it to slip into the mind of a member of the Kingsguard who stood watch near the throne room. Ser Oswell went, a man rumored to be close to Rhaegar, though overshadowed by the fame of Arthur Dayne. If he could influence Ser Oswell at the critical moment, perhaps Rhaegar Stark and Brandon Stark might be spared. That day, Bran felt the swirl of dread as Rhaegar and Brandon were ushered into the throne room. The Mad King looked down from the Iron Throne with malicious glee. Courtiers ringed the hall, some fearful, some curious. Brandon Stark demanded a duel, calling for Rhaegar to face him. The king responded with scorn, ordering a mock trial. Then came the infamous command to tie Brandon in a strangulation device while Rhaegar was forced to watch. The king's pyromancers stood ready with their flickering green flame. The tension in the hall was unbearable. In Ser Oswell's mind, Bran raged against the horror of what was about to happen. "Stop this," Bran willed him. "This is madness. The realm needs the Starks." But the Kingsguard oath was to obey the king. Ser Oswell was torn, for even he felt this was monstrous. He glanced at Ser Gerald Hightower, Ser Arthur Dayne, all expressionless behind their white helms. The king gave the order, "Let them burn. Let the father watch his son strangled. Let the son watch his father roast." Ser Oswell twitched, every part of him wanting to remain still, loyal to the king as duty demanded. Bran pushed harder. "Help them. Now, draw steel." In a swirl of confusion, the knight felt compelled to step forward. He hesitated. The king did not notice, all eyes fixated on Rhaegar Stark being locked into armor, heat swirling around him. Brandon's face twisted in horror as the device around his neck tightened every time he struggled. The tension was excruciating. Then, in a moment that defied everything, Ser Oswell's hand leapt to his sword hilt. He drew steel with a rasp of metal on metal. A hush fell. The king snapped his eyes towards the knight. The entire Kingsguard turned in shock. Time felt suspended. Ser Oswell trembled, his mind a storm of conflict, but Bran poured every ounce of will into him, forcing him to do what he must. "Your Grace," Ser Oswell croaked. His voice echoed in the throne room. Men shifted, uncertain. "This is not justice." The king's eyes blazed with insane fury. "Treason," he shrieked. "Kill him. Kill him now." Chaos erupted. Ser Arthur Dayne lunged, sword half-drawn, uncertain if he was about to strike Ser Oswell or protect him. The gold cloaks roared in confusion. Courtiers shrank back, some screaming. The pyromancers hesitated, holding jars of wildfire. Brandon Stark coughed, strangling as the device tightened around his neck. Rhaegar Stark roared helplessly from within the heated armor, skin blistering. Oswell went, spurred by Bran's control, sprinted towards the device that bound Brandon, hoping to slice it apart, or at least free him enough to end the strangulation. But Ser Arthur Dayne, uncertain of the cause, believing perhaps that Oswell had gone mad or was being manipulated, stepped in front of him with his sword dawn raised. Their blades clashed. Sparks flew. The onlookers gasped. The Mad King screeched, "Burn them all! Burn them all, you fools!" The pyromancers, trembling, prepared to ignite the flames. Bran realized that if he did not act more directly, Rhaegar and Brandon might still die. He forced Oswell into a desperate parry that knocked Dawn aside. "I must save them," Bran thought. But the resolution of a single man, even a Kingsguard, might not be enough in the swirl of the king's madness and the other knight's confusion. Suddenly, Ser Gerald Hightower barked an order. "Ser Oswell, stand down." Then to Arthur Dayne, "Disarm him, do not kill him." The two greatest swordsmen in the realm cornered Oswell, who was torn between fighting them and fulfilling his goal. Meanwhile, the pyromancers advanced on Rhaegar. Screams echoed. Brandon wheezed, face purple. If Ser Oswell was pinned, all would be lost. In a final, frantic surge, Bran abandoned Oswell's mind and lunged at the pyromancers themselves. He found the mind of the nearest one, a young apprentice with shaky hands. The apprentice, half terrified of the king, was easy to seize. Bran forced him to fling the jar of wildfire not on Rhaegar Stark, but upon the dais in front of the king. Wild, frantic flames spilled, the bright green conflagration licking up the steps of the throne. The king reeled back with a shriek, as wildfire erupted too close for comfort. Courtiers scattered in terror. Another pyromancer lost hold of his jar, smashing it at his feet. Green flames burst forth. Smoke churned through the throne room. That moment of chaos gave Ser Oswell enough time to break from Ser Gerald's half-grapple and slash at the mechanical device that strangled Brandon. The metal parted enough for Brandon to slip free, gasping for air. Meanwhile, men rushed to contain the wildfire. Rhaegar collapsed, grievously burned but alive. Smoke enveloped the hall. The king's face twisted with hatred. "Treason!" he howled. "All of them must die." The king's guard, uncertain whom to obey, tried to protect the king from the spreading flames. Bran realized the situation was devolving. But if Brandon and Rhaegar escaped this moment, that alone altered everything. Suddenly, Robert's rebellion might not have the same impetus if the Starks were not murdered. But the king was raving, calling for the heads of Brandon, Rhaegar, and now Ser Oswell went. The gold cloaks advanced. Some of the king's knights tried to block their path. The wailing and confusion soared. Brandon, dazed, helped Rhaegar to his feet. The older man was half alive, his skin blistered. They tried to stumble for the door, but the press of bodies threatened to trap them. Ser Oswell, breathing heavily, recognized the monstrous injustice. He ushered them toward a side corridor while Ser Arthur Dayne hesitated in the center of the chaos, uncertain whether to chase Oswell or protect the king from the flames. The king was frothing at the mouth, demanding that someone kill the traitors. But the immediate threat of wildfire forced many guards to smother the flames with cloaks or wet sacks. That gave Oswell a chance to guide Brandon and Rhaegar out of the throne room, leaving behind the swirling panic. At that moment, Rhaegar appeared at the edge of the corridor, having heard the commotion. Bran, flitting from one vantage to another, saw the prince's shock. Rhaegar looked at his father, cackling in a swirl of green flames and smoke, and then at the retreating Oswell, Brandon, and Rhaegar. He realized that if the king's men caught the Starks, it would be certain death. His father was mad beyond reason. And so, in that fateful instant, Rhaegar gave a nod to Oswell, as if to say, "Go run." Ser Oswell led the Starks away, beyond the keep to the stables, where they could flee the city altogether. Bran followed them, heart pounding with relief and terror. Rhaegar was severely burned and needed urgent care. Brandon raged at the injustice, at the near murder of his father, but also wondered where Lyanna was in all this. Rhaegar had taken her or she had run away with him. No one was certain. But the immediate question was survival. Ser Oswell accompanied them only so far as the Gate of the Gods, expecting to be branded a traitor. He knelt before Rhaegar Stark and said, "I know not if I can return. My oath is to the crown prince, not to the king's madness. Go, my lord, return to Winterfell if you can." Then Oswell turned to slip away into the city's shadows, perhaps hoping to eventually rejoin Rhaegar or find some new path. Brandon and Rhaegar galloped out of King's Landing under the cover of night, aided by a handful of loyal Stark guards who had accompanied them. They had to hurry. The king would soon proclaim them criminals, traitors deserving of death. But everything was different now. The Starks would live. Did that also mean Robert's rebellion would lose steam? Possibly. Or perhaps Robert's fury at Lyanna's supposed abduction would remain. Bran did not know. Already, he had done something unprecedented. He had intervened in a pivotal moment and changed it. As Rhaegar and Brandon rode north, the king unleashed his own brand of vengeance. He declared the Starks enemies of the crown, demanded their heads, called upon loyal houses to deliver them. But the realm watched with uneasy eyes, uncertain if the king's version of events was accurate. Rumors spread of the king's attempt to burn the Starks alive, how only the outbreak of wildfire saved them. Many began to doubt the king's sanity, to recall the times he had locked up lords or had them murdered with his vile sense of humor. And Rhaegar, the crown prince, was nowhere to be found, likely in hiding with Lyanna Stark, or so the rumors claimed. Bran drifted north as well, wanting to see what the survival of Rhaegar and Brandon would bring. They arrived in Winterfell some weeks later, Rhaegar wasted from his burns. Maesters tended him. Brandon, seething with a thirst for justice, summoned the northern bannermen to discuss their next move. The question remained, Did they bow to a king who had nearly murdered them? Did they align with Robert Baratheon, who was also outraged that Lyanna was missing? The North was not quick to move, but the offense was so grave that war seemed inevitable. Rhaegar, from his bed, rasped that if Rhaegar had a hand in abducting Lyanna, the Targaryens must answer for that. But he also recognized that Rhaegar might have saved them, indirectly, by letting them flee. It was complicated. In the corners of the castle, Redwood tried to speak again, insisting that the real enemy lay beyond the wall. War among men was a waste. Some lords believed Redwood was half mad, but Eddard Stark listened carefully. Bran, unseen, felt a surge of gratitude that Redwood persisted, that at least the knowledge was out there. If only they could unify, yet the situation was spiraling. Robert Baratheon was mustering his forces in the Stormlands, outraged by Rhaegar's supposed abduction of Lyanna. The Crown's loyalists were mustering to quell the rebellious Starks. House Tyrell and House Martell teetered on the edge, uncertain whose side to join. The Targaryen dynasty hung in the balance, and overshadowing it all was the hushed truth that the others waited in the far north, patient, unstoppable in time. Bran began to see how fragile mortal affairs were. Even altering a singular event had not prevented the realm from veering towards war. But now it was a different kind of war, one that might not follow the same path. Perhaps there was a chance they could find a negotiated peace if Rhaegar surfaced to dethrone his father and quell the hostilities. Perhaps, if the Starks were no longer murdered outright, they might not be so eager to destroy House Targaryen, focusing only on retrieving Lyanna. Perhaps Redwood's warnings could gain traction one day. This was the beginning of the branching future, and Bran, anchored in the past, was helpless to do anything but keep watching and keep whispering where he could. With each passing moon, he felt the old gods deepening their roots in him. Or was it he who was burying himself in them? He had become more than the boy from Winterfell. He was the three-eyed raven incarnate, cast adrift among the days of yore. If he had a mortal body, it was lost to him now, centuries in the future, or perhaps only decades. He no longer felt hunger in the same way. Sleep was a distant memory. Instead, he felt the pulse of the trees, the shifting of ravens. He felt every subtle thought in men who prayed to the old gods. He was, in some ways, a god himself now, though he had never wanted that. Still, part of him yearned for the siblings he left behind, for Mira, for Arya, for Sansa, for Jon, for Rickon, for the future that might now never come to pass. He pushed down that sorrow and poured himself into a mission, to ensure that men did not forget the real war. In the weeks that followed, the tensions throughout the Seven Kingdoms reached a fever pitch. The Targaryen loyalists, led by some of the king's men, demanded the heads of the Starks for treason. Robert Baratheon, fueled by heartbreak and anger, formed a pact with Jon Arryn and some of the Stormlords to defend the Starks if necessary, hoping to retrieve Lyanna from Rhaegar's clutches. The North hesitated, for Rhaegar Stark, still convalescing, was loath to see the realm in flames. Brandon, however, was hot-headed, eager for war. Ned found himself torn. Redwood whispered of an even greater threat. Divisions formed within Winterfell's own halls. And then, as though summoned by fate, Rhaegar Targaryen emerged. He came not with an army, but with a small retinue of loyalists. Ser Arthur Dayne, Ser Oswell Went, still marked a traitor in the king's eyes, and a few others who believed in Rhaegar's cause. Surprisingly, Lyanna Stark was with them, unbound, seeming neither frightened nor coerced. They appeared at Moat Cailin, the old fortress that guarded the entrance to the north, under a flag of truce. Northern outriders brought word to Winterfell. Bran, drifting amid the ancient weirwoods around Moat Cailin, felt Rhaegar's resolution. The prince was risking everything, riding into the north to speak to House Stark, ignoring the king's commands. He must have known that if the Starks refused him, they could kill him or hand him over to Robert Baratheon, guaranteeing Targaryen downfall. But Rhaegar also believed that only a grand alliance could save Westeros from the threat Redwood had spoken of, and from the madness that was King Aerys. At Winterfell's gates, Rhaegar was given entry. The courtyard was packed with watchers, men bristling with weapons, ready to defend their lord. Rhaegar Stark, bandaged, half lame from his burns, sat in a chair in the great hall. Brandon stood at his side, face like thunder. Eddard stood behind them, calm, watchful. Lyanna, returning with Rhaegar, made some attempt to show her father she was not a prisoner. She took a step forward, calling out, "Father, we must listen." But Brandon snarled, "He abducted you. He disgraced our house." Lyanna, with uncharacteristic restraint, said, "I went willingly, Brandon. Please, let us speak." Tension flared. Many in the hall muttered. Redwood, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt a swirl of hope that Rhaegar might mention the greater war. Rhaegar bowed low, acknowledging Rhaegar Stark's authority. He admitted his wrongdoing, that he should have approached them openly, that he was consumed with prophecy and believed that the union of ice and fire was crucial to saving the realm from a threat beyond the wall. Lyanna, it seemed, shared his fervor after hearing Redwood's warnings and Rhaegar's knowledge. She had chosen to see if there was truth in it, though she had not expected the situation to escalate so violently. Rhaegar confessed that he had not intended to cause war, but he recognized that war might come now that the king had branded the Starks and himself traitors. He believed the king was beyond reason. Brandon's voice was harsh. "You nearly killed our father. He's half burned. You crowned my sister in front of half the realm. And you want us to trust you now." Rhaegar lowered his head. "I never wanted your father or you to die. That was my father's madness, not mine. Let me prove that I stand against him. The realm deserves better." Rhaegar eyed Rhaegar with a mixture of anger and curiosity. "What is this threat you speak of?" Rhaegar spoke of the White Walkers stirring, of Redwood's visions, of the cryptic prophecies he had studied. He said that if the realm were to stand a chance when the long night returned, it must stand united under a stable leadership, not the tyranny of a mad king. He humbly asked if House Stark would support him in ending Aerys' reign. For a moment, the hall was silent. The Targaryen prince was asking for an alliance with the North to depose the king. Brandon erupted. "You want to put yourself on the throne, I see. You sweeten your request with talk of White Walkers and saving the realm, but you are no better than your father." But Lyanna insisted that Rhaegar had saved them from the king's wrath by allowing them to flee, that Ser Oswell had risked his life. Eddard stepped in gently. "We have Redwood, who has insisted that the threat in the north is real. We have the father, who was nearly murdered by Aerys. Perhaps there is something to hear." Rhaegar, in pain, yet resolute, demanded, "If we stand with you, Prince Rhaegar, how do we know we are not dooming ourselves to a Targaryen civil war that leaves the realm in ruins?" Rhaegar answered, "Because I will seek allies across the realm. We will not fight the realm, only the king's loyalists. I have reason to believe many of them despise my father's cruelty. Even Lord Tywin Lannister, though once my father's hand, has grown estranged." He paused, glancing at Lyanna. "I do not deny that my personal actions were rash, but if we do not act, Aerys will only spread more wildfire and paranoia until the realm burns, and the White Walkers will come to find a kingdom too weak to resist them." The hall broke into heated argument. Some of the northern lords wanted no part of Targaryen politics. Others pointed out that if they did nothing, the king would eventually come for them with fire and blood. Redwood, stepping forward, pleaded that the real war was with the undead in the far north. They had to unify. Eddard found Redwood's words compelling, and so did some of the more mystically minded lords. Brandon continued to seethe, while Rhaegar tried to weigh the realm's fate, not just House Stark's. Finally, Rhaegar spoke. "I have lived long enough to see the futility of these petty wars. If we agree to aid you, we must do so with conditions that protect the North and ensure a swift resolution to your conflict. And I will not abide a usurper who only wants to wear his father's crown but remain blind to the real threats." Rhaegar bowed. "Name your conditions, my lord." And thus began negotiations that would forever alter the tapestry of Westeros. House Stark demanded that once Aerys was deposed, Rhaegar would be crowned king only if he pledged to unify the realm's armies against the threat from beyond the wall, and also recognized certain northern autonomies. Lyanna's position was precarious. It was rumored she carried Rhaegar's child, though it was too soon to be certain. If that was true, House Stark wanted the child acknowledged. Such demands would scandalize the realm, but Rhaegar was desperate enough to agree. He wanted to end his father's rule. He believed that a child of Targaryen and Stark blood might indeed be the savior the prophecy foretold. Meanwhile, Redwood insisted that preparations be made at the wall, that more men be sent to the Night's Watch, that scouting parties be dispatched into the haunted forest. Everyone who listened shuddered at the idea. The seeds of alliance thus sown, Rhaegar and Rhaegar parted with the uneasy understanding that war was coming. Rhaegar would muster forces from any lords loyal to him in the Crownlands and beyond, while the Starks kept the north prepared. Rhaegar allowed Rhaegar to remain in Winterfell with Lyanna, mostly in secrecy, while the prince sent out ravens to potential allies. Lord Tywin Lannister, House Martell, House Baratheon, though Robert's reaction was uncertain, House Arryn, House Tully, the great powers that would sway the tide. Word reached Robert in the Stormlands soon enough that Lyanna was in Winterfell with Rhaegar, forging an accord with him. Robert flew into a fury, feeling betrayed by the Starks and by Lyanna. He believed the Targaryen had bewitched her. He swore vengeance. Jon Arryn tried to calm him, but Robert's sense of heartbreak was too deep. He called his banners, insisting that the Targaryen line must be ended. Some Stormlords agreed wholeheartedly, recalling the atrocities of the Mad King. Others were more cautious. The realm teetered on the brink of a multi-sided conflict. The Mad King's forces, Prince Rhaegar's loyalists, and Robert's rebellious faction. House Stark now stood behind Rhaegar, albeit with reservations. Nothing in the known histories resembled this complex situation. Bran marveled at the chaos he had unleashed. Rhaegar and Brandon Stark lived. Lyanna was with Rhaegar forging an alliance. Redwood's warnings were seeping through the edges of Lords' councils. But was it enough to prevent the cataclysm that was to come? The question haunted him as he roamed from weirwood to weirwood, from crow to raven, observing the realm's preparations. The king's madness grew. He demanded that all traitors be burned in wildfire. He commanded the pyromancers to stockpile stores of it beneath King's Landing. He insisted that armies converge to punish the rebellious North and his own son's betrayal. Many suspected that if he lost the coming war, he would reduce the city to ash. Rhaegar's supporters grew in strength, outraged by the king's monstrous plots, yet the memory of Targaryen might still made some lords hesitant. Among the lords who responded to Rhaegar's call, Mace Tyrell indicated a willingness to negotiate. House Martell, humiliated by Rhaegar's slight to Elia, was divided, but some recognized that if Rhaegar took the throne, Elaya's children might still hold power. Even Tywin Lannister, who had parted ways with the Mad King in bitterness, might see an opportunity to place himself in the new regime's favor. The realm was like a pot on the boil. Only Robert Baratheon seemed determined to see Rhaegar dead at any cost. Bran watched, powerless to fast-forward time. He realized that every single day, men made choices that shaped fate. He had once believed the past was fixed and the future was fluid, but now the past was becoming just as fluid. If he had the will, he might push certain minds further, create illusions or whisper in dreams, but he began to fear the enormity of the changes. The further events strayed from what should have been, the less certain Bran was of the final outcome. In his old timeline, the living eventually united to defeat the White Walkers at enormous cost. But if the realm tore itself apart earlier, or in a different way, might it be too weakened or too chaotic to unite in time? Or might it be better prepared, forging a stable Targaryen monarchy under a more just king, forging alliances that would stand strong against the dead? There was no simple answer. Bran felt a longing for the cave beneath the weirwood tree, for the three-eyed raven's guidance. But that teacher was gone. Only Bran remained, trying to do what he thought was right. He reminded himself that his presence here was an accident of sorts. Yet he could not turn away now. He steeled himself, for war was coming. King Aerys marched his southern host north, proclaiming that traitors infested the entire upper half of the continent. Men from the Reach, the Stormlands, and even the Westerlands were compelled to choose sides. Battles erupted in small pockets along the riverlands. where House Tully tried to remain neutral but was inevitably drawn in. The Vale, behind Jon Arryn, tried to quell Robert's rage, to no avail. Meanwhile, Rhaegar quietly mustered a loyalist host in the Crownlands, moving them north to meet with the Starks, forging a plan to confront the king. It was a civil war that never happened in Bran's timeline. There, it had been Robert's rebellion, a single conflict that ended the Targaryen dynasty. Here, it was Targaryen father against Targaryen son, with House Stark strangely aligned to the prince, while Robert was cut loose by his own heartbreak and hatred. The realm stood at three corners, and still the White Walkers waited, silent, beyond the wall. Winter was not yet upon them in full, but the signs were there. Colder winds, deeper snows in the gift, rumors of missing rangers. Redwood tried to draw attention to it, but men were consumed by their own battles. Eddard Stark, though, kept Redwood close, listening to his counsel, sending ravens to the Night's Watch to request updates. The Watch reported disturbing rumors. Glimpses of pale figures in the trees, whites sighted in the Frostfangs. But none of it seemed as pressing to the realm's lords as the war at hand. Bran observed that certain lords in the north took Redwood's words seriously. They began discreetly stockpiling dragonglass from the hills, forging more weapons, and encouraging watchtowers to remain alert. Eddard Stark, newly thrust into a leadership role while his father recovered, also prepared for the possibility that the war might eventually shift northward. He told Redwood in a quiet moment, "If Rhaegar wins and we unify the realm, we'll bring its might to the wall. If we lose and the Mad King prevails, the realm is doomed anyway." Redwood nodded grimly. Meanwhile, Rhaegar and Lyanna grew closer, bound not just by prophecy but genuine affection. Lyanna's free spirit and Rhaegar's gentle intensity wove together. Brandon Stark seethed, but Eddard tried to quell his brother's anger for the sake of a larger cause. Ricard, from his bed, simply prayed that the realm would survive. In King's Landing, the Mad King's fury reached new heights. He discovered that Rhaegar and the Starks were forging an alliance, that half the realm was turning from him. He demanded that the pyromancers prepare caches of wildfire beneath not just King's Landing but other major cities that might resist him. His mania was unstoppable. Lords who questioned him were burned. Queen Rhaella was rumored to be in hiding. The city's population whispered of a dark, final conflagration if Rhaegar's host drew near. The king's shadow loomed over everything. Bran recognized the final confrontation was near. If Rhaegar's forces marched on King's Landing, the king might ignite the city in a wave of wildfire, slaughtering thousands. In the original timeline, Jaime Lannister had slain the king to prevent such destruction. But now events had changed. Bran considered, if he could somehow push Jaime again at the crucial moment, or push the king's own men to turn on him, it might save the city from ruin. He dreaded the possibility that one misstep might see the capital wiped out and the realm gutted. Then the White Walkers would face even less resistance. The entire realm might be lost. Even as these armies marched, Robert Baratheon gathered his own. He refused to side with the Mad King but also refused to join Rhaegar, the man who he believed had stolen Lyanna's love. Robert had sworn that if he encountered Rhaegar on the field, he would kill him. The stage was set for a cataclysmic triple conflict outside King's Landing, as the Mad King's host, Prince Rhaegar's loyalists, bolstered by many from the north and some from the Crownlands, and Robert's outraged stormlords all converged. House Lannister hovered, waiting to see which side might be best to support at the final hour, to slip in and decide the outcome. House Tyrell dithered. House Martell, bitter about Elia, was uncertain if they should support Rhaegar or remain neutral. The realm was in turmoil. Bran felt a suffocating weight of guilt, but also hope. He had achieved something. The Targaryen father's murder of the Starks had been averted. Ricard and Brandon lived. He had introduced Redwood's warnings earlier than ever. Rhaegar was committed to fighting the White Walkers once the throne was secured. That might lead to a realm better prepared for the long night. But the cost was a brutal civil war that might tear the continent apart. Perhaps that was the price of meddling with time. There was no turning back now. He could only watch as these armies drew closer and closer to the capital. Smoke from their campfires dotted the horizon for miles. The city's gates were barred, the king's men manning the walls with scorpions and archers. The stockpiles of wildfire lay hidden in the cellars below. Rhaegar's host approached from the north, Robert's from the south. Each day brought news of skirmishes, men testing each other's lines, supply wagons attacked, outriders ambushed. In the Red Keep, the king shrieked and threatened to unleash green flame on them all if they would not kneel. Bran realized the moment of truth was near. He tried, in vain, to glean where Jaime Lannister was stationed. The young Kingsguard was certainly near the king, sworn to protect him. If Jaime repeated his act of betrayal from the original timeline at the crucial juncture, it might save the city. But if events transpired differently, if, say, the king never gave Jaime that dreadful order, or if Jaime wavered, then who would halt the Mad King's final suicidal plan? The swirling possibilities made Bran's consciousness reel. Once again, he found a vantage in the Red Keep's godswood, such as it was, to wait for the fateful hour. He prepared himself to slip into the mind of whomever might stop the king's madness. At dawn on a fateful day, the city awoke to the booming of war drums. Rhaegar's army had formed lines to the north. Robert's forces were arrayed to the south. The king's loyalists manned the walls. The king himself raved, ordering ravens to be sent with final demands. That Rhaegar and Robert both bend the knee or burn. No one bent the knee. Instead, the hours passed in tense stalemate. Then Robert's horns blasted, and a wave of Stormland knights charged one of the city's southern gates. Rhaegar's men, aware of the attack, chose that moment to assault the northern defenses, seeking to break through. The city shook with the thunder of siege engines. A hideous day of slaughter began. Bran watched in horror as tens of thousands clashed. The outer wards of King's Landing were soon awash with blood. Yet it was not an orderly siege. Rhaegar tried to take the walls with siege towers, while Robert battered at the main gate. The defenders poured down boiling oil, rained arrows on the attackers. The king, from his vantage on the Iron Throne, demanded the pyromancers stand ready. Rumors of a massive stockpile beneath the city soared among soldiers on both sides. As the day wore on and the walls began to crack under the onslaught, the king's mania peaked. He declared that if he could not rule Westeros, he would see it reduced to ash. He called for his pyromancers to ignite the secret caches of wildfire. That was the moment Bran had been waiting for, the moment that had once driven Jaime Lannister to kill the king. But in this new timeline, the swirl of events had changed who was near the king, who was loyal, who might intervene. Bran slipped into the mind of a gold cloak officer near the king, for that was the only man he found with a receptive mind in the throne room. Through that officer's eyes, he saw the king rise from the throne, eyes lit with madness, demanding the city burn. He heard the king instruct one of the pyromancers, "Light the fires, let them all die. I will be king of the ashes." The officer trembled, uncertain. The pyromancer advanced, carrying a torch, about to descend to the dungeons. Bran hurled all his will through that officer. The man lunged at the pyromancer, grappling for the torch. The king shrieked in outrage. The Kingsguard, led by Jaime Lannister, stood uncertain. This was the same moment in the original timeline that had tested Jaime's oath. The difference was that now the officer was acting first. Jaime's eyes flickered with recognition of the king's mania. The king screeched, "Stop him! Stop them all! Burn them, you fools! Burn them!" For a heartbeat, Jaime hesitated, memories of the king's cruelty weighing on him. Then, just as in the original timeline, Jaime drew his sword. He cut down the pyromancer with a single stroke, and then he turned that sword on the king. The Mad King's final scream echoed in the throne room as Jaime's blade pierced his back. The officer stumbled away, the lit torch clattering harmlessly on the stone. The king collapsed, dead. The city was saved from wildfire. The bells began to ring, signifying the king's death. Beyond the walls, the tide of battle soon shifted as word spread that the Mad King was slain. Rhaegar's men pressed the advantage, claiming they fought for the new king, Rhaegar Targaryen. Robert Baratheon's men, equally determined, tried to seize the moment to kill Rhaegar and end the Targaryens entirely. The chaos was tremendous, but with the king's death, many in the city's garrison surrendered rather than die for a corpse's cause. Rhaegar's force eventually battered its way into the city from the northern side. Robert hammered from the south, his personal fury driving him forward. The two forces clashed in the streets, debris and rubble all around. Citizens cowered in their homes. Eventually, in the square before the Red Keep, Robert and Rhaegar came face to face, each with their guard. Bran watched from the vantage of a raven perched on a broken spire. The two men stared, swords in hand, bloodied from battle, dust swirling. Rhaegar, hammered by fatigue, managed a semblance of calm, calling out that the Mad King was dead, that the war could end. Robert snarled that the Targaryens had to pay for their crimes, that they had stolen Lyanna. Rhaegar tried to tell him that Lyanna was free to choose, that she had chosen to remain with him for the sake of the realm. Robert roared, brandishing his warhammer. Rhaegar's face showed sorrow, as if he realized there was no bridging Robert's hatred. They charged each other, steel against steel, hammer against sword. The circle of men around them parted, letting their leaders settle it. In Bran's original timeline, Robert had crushed Rhaegar at the trident, delivering a mortal blow to the prince's chest. But here, the duel took place in the rubble of the capital, the stakes even higher. Rhaegar was no feeble man. He was skilled, swift with a blade. Yet Robert's strength and fury were legendary. The fight raged back and forth, each delivering punishing blows. Rhaegar's armor gleamed Targaryen black and red, but soon it was dented and battered. Robert's hammer threatened to break through. Rhaegar managed a slash across Robert's shoulder, staggering him. Robert roared in pain, smashing his hammer into Rhaegar's side. Rhaegar gasped, nearly toppled. The watchers braced themselves, uncertain who would prevail. For a moment, it seemed Robert might land a final blow. Then a new voice cried out across the square, "Stop!" Lyanna Stark, flanked by Eddard, emerged from behind a group of Stark men who had arrived late with the northern host. She rushed forward, ignoring the pleas of her brother. Robert hesitated, his eyes wide at the sight of Lyanna. Rhaegar seized that moment to retreat a step, panting, sword poised. Lyanna stood between them, arms raised, tears on her cheeks. "Robert, please, enough. The Mad King is dead. This war is over if you let it be over." Robert, stunned, lowered his hammer a fraction. "Lyanna, you stand with him still?" She nodded, tears falling. "I do. This realm needs him. You must see that. He saved my father, my brother. He ended the king's cruelty." Robert glared, chest heaving, eyes flicking from Lyanna to Rhaegar. "He took you from me," he spat. Lyanna shook her head. "No one took me. I left. I was never yours to own. I am sorry for the pain I caused, but the realm is bigger than us. Bigger than you, me, or Rhaegar." Eddard stepped forward, carefully, sword lowered. "Robert, the fighting can end. We can unify behind a new king who is not mad. We can prepare for the winter to come, for the threat beyond the wall. This is our chance to unite the realm. Please, old friend." Robert trembled, tears mingling with sweat and blood. For a moment, hatred contorted his features. He raised his hammer as if to strike, but his strength failed him. He let the hammer fall to the ground with a clang. "I have lost everything," he muttered. Then he sank to his knees. The circle of watchers parted. The clangor of battle still sounded in the distance, but here, a hush descended. Rhaegar, battered, leaned on his sword. Then he extended a hand, the gesture of a man offering peace. Robert stared at it, a swirl of emotions on his face. Betrayal, sorrow, regret, shame. Then, at last, he let Rhaegar help him up. He said nothing, eyes dull with heartbreak. But the fighting ceased. In the aftermath, Rhaegar Targaryen was proclaimed king by many of the city's lords. The Gold Cloaks, the Small Folk, and even Jaime Lannister, who had slain the king, bent the knee to him. Robert's men, seeing their leader yield, laid down arms. Eddard Stark, with House Stark's men, confirmed their alliance with Rhaegar. The war ended in a single day of slaughter, but it had not ended in the utter downfall of House Targaryen nor with Rhaegar's death. Instead, King Aerys lay in a pool of his own blood, undone by his madness. King Rhaegar took the Iron Throne. Lyanna Stark stood at his side, pregnant with a child rumored to be of both dragon and wolf. Robert Baratheon, broken-hearted, returned to the Stormlands, stripped of his dream of wedding Lyanna, overshadowed by the new rule. The realm would take time to heal, but for the moment, the new king promised a more stable era. Bran observed these events from the hush of the Red Keep's Godswood. He heard men talk in the corridors of how the new King Rhaegar was convening a grand council, inviting all lords to come to King's Landing to reaffirm their fealty. He intended to address the threat in the north next, sending more men to the Night's Watch, forging alliances with the Children of the Forest if any yet remained. The future was uncertain, but it was not the future Bran had known. The destruction of House Stark, the death of Rhaegar, the reign of Robert, none of that had come to pass. The timeline was irrevocably changed. Winter was still coming, but perhaps this time, the realm would stand more united under a Targaryen king who was not mad, with the support of House Stark and the knowledge of Redwood's warnings. It might just be enough to meet the White Walkers on equal footing. Bran felt a quiver of hope, mixed with apprehension. So many threads had been twisted by his presence. Would it indeed lead to the salvation of the living, or would new catastrophes bloom from these changes? Only time could tell, time that he was now bound to. As the crows circled the towers of King's Landing in the dusky sky, Bran turned his gaze northward, where the wall stood as a silent sentinel. The White Walkers stirred, but perhaps in this new age, they would not find the realm so unprepared. Perhaps the forging of ice and fire in the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna would indeed bring forth some champion. Perhaps the dawn would come sooner. Bran hovered among the branches, feeling the swirl of distant voices as men whispered thanks or curses to the old gods. He had stayed in the past, stepping so deeply into its currents that returning to the future was impossible. He was no longer simply Bran Stark of Winterfell. He was an echo in the Weirwood, a soul forging history anew. The consequences would shape centuries to come. And in that heavy hush, as the red leaves of the heart tree rustled in the wind, Bran whispered a silent prayer that the realm would endure, for he had tried his best, and there was no turning back.